Long Voyage Back, Part 23. Vagabond then proceeded slowly up the channel towards the small town of Morehead City, which lay in almost total darkness, and in another hour she was anchored 100 feet off the main line of the docks. Neil wanted them all to be able to get some sleep before they had to confront the world that awaited them on shore. Although it was 4:30 and dawn should have been breaking, the storm system kept the sky as dark as night. As the boat was being anchored, Jean came up on deck and went down to make hot tea for Neil, Frank and Tony, who soon joined her in the main cabin. She was pale, with a grey puffiness under the eyes from a long bout of seasickness. But now that Vagabond was merrily rocking gently in the gusting blasts of wind and not playing at roller coaster, she was feeling better. Ollie was already slumped asleep in the little corner jump seat in the forward end of the room. "I could use a drink," Tony announced, staring irritably at his tea. "Aren't we supposed to celebrate a landfall?" "Do you feel like celebrating?" Neil asked. "I don't feel a damn thing," Tony answered, taking the bottle of brandy Jean put on the table. "I'm too beat." "Thank God we made it back to land," Jean said softly, standing with her back to the seated men. Neil, Frank and Tony looked up at her, and then Frank stood up and went over to her. While the other two men looked on silently, he embraced her. "Will we be able to find a place to live?" Jean asked Frank, looking up at him. "They have a refugee camp," Frank answered. Is that where we're all going?" she asked with a surprised frown. "It looks that way," said Frank. "All the men aboard except Frank and Ollie have to report for military service," Neil said. "But why?" Jean asked, freeing herself from Frank's arms and again looking surprised. "What possible use can any of you be in the army?" "We're at war, Jean," Frank replied, sitting down opposite Neil. "No, we're not," Jean responded passionately. "This isn't a war. It's genocidal suicide." They all looked up at her. "We're at war, Jean," Frank repeated. "Our country has been attacked." "Neil, you don't believe in this draft, do you?" Jean said, looking flushed with anger or excitement. "I suppose it's like this ship," Neil answered after a long pause. "In a survival situation, everyone has to belong to a military hierarchy, or there's chaos. Drafting everyone is the government's way of keeping us out of mischief." "And we'll be needed in the army too," Tony said. "They're not calling us up just to keep an eye on us." "They'll need everybody's help if the war lasts long enough," Frank suggested. The silence was not a happy one. "I'm not going, Dad," Jim said, appearing unexpectedly on the companionway steps. "What do you mean, Jimmy?" Frank asked, frowning. Jim came down the 3 steps and stood a few paces behind his father. Lisa appeared in the cabin entrance. "I can't report for military service," he said nervously. I won't go." Frank turned to look at his son and then returned his gaze to Jean, who had sat down opposite him. "I'm afraid the President has ordered almost all of us to serve," he said. "I know, Dad, but I won't fight in this war. Not unless the Russians land troops." "No one likes fighting nukes," Tony said, "but we've got to serve." "It's not the nukes and the radiation anymore," Jim said. "It's just that I've decided this war is all wrong, no matter—" "What about your country?" Frank interrupted, not looking at his son. "I just think, I don't know. I want to sail south with you, Dad. Help Lisa and Jean and—" "What about your country?" Frank repeated stonily. I know, Jim said, a flicker of anguish on his face unseen by his father. "I owe my country a lot. I know that. But the war seems so insane. The kind of killing so wrong. I don't see how—" "Jim can't save the country," Jean said as Jim trailed off. "But he's goddamn well gonna try," Frank spat out angrily, banging his fist on the table, tipping over the almost empty bottle of brandy. As Tony righted it, old Captain Ollie's body jerked upright and his eyes blinked open. "Huh?" he said. "What say?" Frank swung his head around to look at Neil. "Are you going to report for duty?" he asked. "What I do is not relevant," Neil answered. "With my naval experience, in theory I can be of service, but untrained teenagers would only be cannon fodder. If Jim thinks the war is all wrong, he shouldn't go, and I may not go either." Frank felt a strange, sinking feeling and glared at Neil. "I should have known," he said. "You've taken wishy-washy positions so long you've forgotten a man's duty to his country." "I know my duty to my country," Neil snapped back. "I just happen to believe that my country is now located primarily on this boat." "That's inconvenient," said Frank, "because in this case I'm kicking you out of your country. He felt both a senseless rage and an urge to cry. "In other words, you're fired!" The words seemed hollow even as he spoke them. "Are you going to force Jim to be in the war?" Jean asked. "He's in it whether he likes it or not." "I'm not going to report, Dad," Jim said, now more steadily. "I'd like to help sail everyone south." "You need Jim," Jean said softly to Frank. "In this world, if we're lucky enough to have any children still with us, the last thing we should do is let them go." Frank stared at the cushion between Jean and Neil, and unseeingly added more brandy to his empty teacup, his eyes wet. A siren wailing off in the city half a mile away underlined the silence in the cabin. Captain Ollie again awakened. "Don't recommend telling grown kids what to do," he said. "No one asked you," Frank muttered. "Shh, okay," replied Ollie. "I don't mind volunteering good advice. People who ask for advice generally made up their minds anyhow." Jean rose from her seat. "I'm going to get more sleep," she said. "Good night, Captain Ollie, Tony. Good night, Neil." She paused. "Good night, Frank." She leaned down and held his head in her arms and pressed her face against his hair for several seconds. "You're a good man, Frank. But you're absolutely wrong about Jim." And she left. "That's one sweet lady, that is," Captain Ollie said. "Ain't met a woman like her since my last wife. She married?" The ship's clock on the forward wall of the cabin struck 6 bells. Neil glanced at it. "We should set a watch this morning, Frank," he said. "We haven't seen the last of the pirates. I'll take the first 2-hour watch and wake Jim for the second. We can all get up at 10. Frank looked up dully. "You still trying to run things?" he said, and then let his head fall forward. Vagabond was back on land. Morehead City, over 150 miles distant from the nearest nuclear explosion, a small town in the middle of a rich farming and fishing region, had, in a way, like most of the rest of the country, ceased to exist. Its restaurants, bars, drugstores, service stations, movie theatres, supermarkets, grocery stores, gift shops, banks, and most retail stores were closed. The only traditional commercial enterprises open for a few hours each day were the clothing and hardware store, and one bar. All had become unofficial bartering centres. The town had electricity, at least in theory, but the military authorities were systematically disconnecting electrical service to all except businesses or institutions they considered necessary. The town had food, at least in theory, since a few fishermen still brought in their catches and neighbouring farmers still had chickens, pigs, cows, and a few early summer crops. But fuel was unavailable for either the fishing trawlers or farm machinery, and harvests from both sea and land were diminishing. No food arrived from outside the county, and all food inside it was being requisitioned for distribution and rationing by the army. Much of it was being shifted to areas where the need was greater. More than half the arable land was planted in tobacco. Since no private vehicles were permitted on the road without authorization, most normal social life had ended. Local draft-age adults had disappeared either into one of the services or into the faceless mass of refugees fleeing even further south. Those remaining consisted of men over 40, the sick and the maimed, and women and children. Few people other than farmers and fishermen were still able to practice the same occupation they had been in the week before. All newspapers and television stations had ceased operating. Only one radio station went on the air on a limited schedule, its sole function being to transmit official information and instructions from the national government or local military authorities. There was no music. The national networks had ceased to exist, but the government was able to use satellites to transmit messages to all stations at once. All manufacturing not directly related to military needs had ceased. All large department stores had sold out of basic items in the first 3 days of the war. Flashlights, generators, batteries, coolers, knives, hatchets, tools, guns, fishing equipment, camping gear, cooking fuels, and so on. And now, filled with the useless non-essentials, television sets, phonographs, cosmetics, fashionable clothing, they remain closed, unguarded, and unlooted. The churches alone were booming. Most held services of one sort or another every day, and the street corner end of the world preachers gathering small crowds around them immediately, people who listened apathetically and then wandered away. The little town had received an influx of refugees from the areas around Washington and Norfolk, the first wave arriving by car and truck, those in the last few days by foot, bicycle, horse and cart, and by boat down the intercoastal waterway. Many were suffering from burns, blindness, and radiation sickness. When the survivors on Vagabond were awakened by Jim at 10 o'clock, they saw that boats were jammed into every available space, rafted 2 and 3 deep in places. Neil eased Vagabond in against an apparently unoccupied luxury yacht, the only space large enough to take the 50-foot trimaran alongside. After a reconnaissance ashore in the gusty wind and rain, it was clear that most of the boats had either been deserted for want of fuel or crew, or were owned by people determined to get further south. Some hoped to continue down the intercoastal waterway, and a few were planning to go out the inlet. Whether the latter would be carrying passengers who had been officially called to duty and forbidden to leave was unclear. Most people were tight-lipped about their plans and personnel. Posted prominently on several dockside telephone poles were posters printed by hand and Xerox, warning mariners that no ships were permitted to leave the inlet with any male of military age aboard without the written authorization from the district commander. Looking out toward the inlet, Neil could see 2 US Navy vessels, one looking badly damaged, moored in the turning basin. He had never known warships to use Morehead City, but with the naval facilities at Hampton Roads near Norfolk destroyed, the Navy's options were clearly reduced.